Final Fantasy IX boasts more than a few badges that make it a unique entry to the series. It is the final single-digit installment. It is the last of the games to be created for the PlayStation 1, and, perhaps most famously, it is the final time in the Final Fantasy series where creator Hironobu Sakaguchi and composer Nobuo Uematsu worked together in their respective roles. Though their reasons differed, Sakaguchi feeling dejected after the critical failure that was the Spirits Within movie, and Uematsu citing executive meetings taking away from composition time, the two left Square for greener pastures. This being the case, Sakaguchi made it a point to step back into a hands-on role for Final Fantasy IX. He wanted to see off the series that he had so lovingly created, worked on, and oversaw as it was led into the new era. This decision would see him stepping out of the general producer role he had maintained for the 7th and 8th installments. This new entry was to be a swan song, not just for the single-digit series entries or the 5th generation of consoles. It was Sakaguchi's way of lovingly and respectfully tying up this bow that is the Final Fantasy series. One final outpour of devoted creation and dedicated passion to the series that made him a legend, and to the fans who loved him and his games so. It's difficult to put into words what Final Fantasy IX means to me. I grew up playing games that were lighter on story. Fighting games on the Sega Saturn, the Super Mario Land Game Boy trilogy, and, of course, the ubiquitous cultural phenomenon that was Pokémon. I loved these games, and I still do to this day, but they represented what I considered video games at the time to be, even if my 8 or 9-year-old vocabulary couldn't quite articulate it. Entertaining gameplay loops that you could pick up and put down at a whim. Nothing more. But discovering Final Fantasy IX changed everything for me. What began as a rental game over the weekend with my childhood best friend quickly turned into a fascination. I was drawn to its magnetic charm, wholly enticed by its world in a way that no other game had done to me before. It planted in me seeds that sprouted a lifelong passion for storytelling in video games and showed me that characters on screen could have not only actual personalities, but insecurities, desires, fears, and dreams, in the same ways that I had and continue to have myself. Before beginning, I want to explain why this intro episode exists, as I've never done this on the show before. This essay is intended to be a sort of companion piece to the series on the podcast, an introduction before the main course of going through the entire story. To that end, it will likely be a little shorter than previous essays on the show. It will be a mixture of background information, critical analysis, and personal feelings. My intent here isn't to create a one-and-done definitive essay. You'll have about 10 hours of content in episodes 2 through 5. Here, I simply wanted to preface and speak intelligently and passionately about something very meaningful to me. The format for this show in general is to begin with a synopsis of the game itself, development history, personal histories from myself and my guests, overall thoughts regarding the music and mechanics, things of that nature. Why am I putting that information here instead of in the episode? Honestly, I don't really know. I didn't want to do the same old when covering a game that's been on the show before. I wanted to offer something different, especially for longtime listeners who heard the first go at this game. I have plans to recover other games from the show's history as well, but I'm not entirely sure that I'll do an intro essay for those. Time will tell. This is sort of just me taking a creative risk. For this specific case, too, I knew that the 100th episode was approaching and that I wanted to make it meaningful, a sort of mild commemoration for sticking this hobby out so long. That being so, and being that Final Fantasy IX is a very special game in my heart, the pieces sort of fell together into my lap. And so, here we are, once again journeying through Gaia, together. I'm so pleased that you're coming with us as we talk across 5 episodes. 5 episodes of exploring, 5 episodes of heartache, 5 episodes of unbridled joy, and ultimately, 5 episodes celebrating the game that changed my life. Well, as far as video games go, anyway. But before we get there, I'd like to paint the scene for you. Let's take a look back to the late 90s and examine how this game came to be. Final Fantasy IX began development in July of 1998. If you're unfamiliar with the timeline of Square during these years, Final Fantasy VIII released in February of 1999, putting the two games' development cycles into overlap with each other. As I previously alluded to, Sakaguchi had elected to step back into a hands-on approach for the development of 9. The PlayStation titles of 7 and 8 had attempted to move Final Fantasy into a more mature, gritty sci-fi style of storytelling, and Sakaguchi became worried about the series becoming stagnant if this progression were to continue. Producer Shinji Hashimoto had this to say regarding Sakaguchi's ideals and ambitions. Quote, Sakaguchi-san wanted it to be completely different from Final Fantasy 7 and 8, with a story and flavor that was distinctly his. That left an impression on me. There was Final Fantasy VII, which was kind of steampunk sci-fi. Final Fantasy VIII is a school story, a love story, and a really human story set in a realistic city. For Final Fantasy IX, Mr. Sakaguchi wanted to go back to the action movie-like adventure fantasy of the first 6 Final Fantasy titles, and those elements are abundant in this game. End quote. Art director Hideo Minaba echoes these sentiments, stating, quote, as this is the last single-digit Final Fantasy, we wanted to give the feeling of a series watershed, a sort of grand collection of what has come before, end quote. And one last sentiment from Shinji Hashimoto reads, Sakaguchi wanted to return to a cinematic, fantasy-inspired experience similar to Final Fantasy VI. This is, of course, readily noticeable almost immediately upon the game's start. Within the first half hour, players are shown the vast landscapes of one of the most major kingdoms in the story, the Kingdom of Alexandria. Vibrant colors across a blue sky appear with each truck and shift of the camera. City streets paved with stone serve as a stage where children play. Birds soar through the sky among airships, literal aquatic-style ships flying via in-world technology, and small shops and stores are visited by commoners and nobles alike, all surrounded by a magnificent castle. And then, we're greeted with our title card. This is Final Fantasy IX. There's no shortage of grandiosity in the world of Final Fantasy IX. Across deserts, forgotten continents, cities of wealth, cities of dwarves, the world of Final Fantasy IX is full of wonder. The decision to return to this style was, as far as I'm concerned, a total boon. I enjoyed my time with Final Fantasy VII and VIII, but they were missing that sense of childlike awe that fantasy stories give us permission to feel. And it's not a coincidence that I felt that way while traveling across the lands 9 had to offer. The design team stated that they had the intent to create a world that, quote, a child might dream up. Anthropomorphic animals living alongside humans, Moogles delivering the mail, wild monsters as cute as squirrels or as fierce as dragons. It's all here. It's interesting to note, too, that the event and scenario designers handled the designs of the various maps on a person-by-person basis. Each member of the team was responsible for designing and writing a single area of the map. Then, they would come together as a unit, put it all together, and get down to the real work: editing. As an outsider, this strategy sounds extremely effective. Many areas and scenarios could be worked on at once, and after they're reasonably developed, the team could come together as a cohesive unit to smooth things down and create a consistent tone and language style. This surely required a lot of trust between the members of the team, but the dividends paid out speak for themselves. I have a hunch that that is one of the reasons the writing in this game is so strong. And that's exactly what I'd like to speak on next. Final Fantasy as a series has always had memorable characters aplenty, and these characters and their motivations were often explored. Whether it's Cecil's shift to becoming a paladin, Cyan's tragic loss of his family, or Squall's childhood abandonment trauma, Sakaguchi and his teams have never been afraid to explore the inner machinations of their characters and their respective psyches. This is all true, and the series deserves praise for it. Final Fantasy IX, however, raised the bar. It's just that simple. The characters and character writing in this game, the dialogue in particular, is far and away the strongest that the series had seen up until this point. The criticisms I have for 7 and 8 in particular generally fall into the writing category. Characters in the original iteration of 7 aren't fleshed out well enough such that anybody has a distinct personality or voice. One might argue Barrett, sure, but are we really going to cite a derivation of Mr. T for this argument? I don't know about that. Even Sephiroth himself is somewhat derivative of Kefka. Final Fantasy VIII, too, had issues with this, though I felt that the dialogue and characters were handled better in 8 as compared to 7, we still see major characters shuffled off to the side and not given the care that they deserve for their arcs. See Quistis, for example. And it's been said and noted that the localization in English changed Squall's dialogue enough that he earned a reputation of being emo. The ... whatever refrain that he so often repeats isn't quite the same in the Japanese script. It changes. Sometimes it's, I understand. Sometimes it's, alright, I get it. Other times it's a sarcastic, sorry. And both 7 and 8 tend to use pretty similar character archetypes. A brooding protagonist, a close sidekick who is well-meaning but boisterous, a character with unrequited feelings that moves to eventually accept the situation, a pretty boy with a gun. I'm being a bit reductive here, but suffice to say that while I genuinely believe both games to be well above average for the genre, the dialogue and character writing had room to grow. And grow it did. One of the first characters we meet in Final Fantasy IX is a young boy named Vivi. A fan favorite, Vivi is a 9-year-old who, throughout the course of the story, grows up much faster than you might expect. You'll hear more about his character development in episodes 2 through 5, so I don't want to dwell on much here, but what I do want to guide your attention to, so that you may latch onto it better throughout the following episodes, is how Vivi communicates. He is forced to grow and develop well beyond his years in an astoundingly short amount of time due to trauma and tragedies. Turn after turn, it seems that the universe delights in nothing more than attempting to extinguish the light in Vivi's soul. Naturally, he struggles a lot with this, internally and externally. And we as the players are privileged to oftentimes hear his inner monologues. What I love about how Vivi is written is that they didn't try to make him into a hyper-mature kid or easily understand adult concepts. This is a trope we see in fiction constantly and is a consequence of adults trying too hard to write children. The results are often either infantilizing or produce adult characters in children's bodies, if that makes sense. It's a difficult balance to strike, but strike it they did with Vivi. Much like the whole cast, he has a unique way of speaking and, when processing intense life events, uses language that a child would use. After the death of an antagonistic character at the hands of another antagonistic character, Vivi wonders to himself why he's feeling sad. I hated this person a lot, he thinks to himself. So much that I wanted this to happen. I should be happy, but once I saw Garnet start to cry, I didn't know how I should feel. I kind of wanted to cry too. A major arc in Vivi's development is an inverse of the game's strongest theme. the game's theme being to live, and Vivi's development starting around what it means to die. I don't think I really understand what it means to live and to die, a somber Vivi thinks to himself after a difficult discussion surrounding the death of some newfound friends. He continues, "Where do we come from? Do we go back there when we die? Where will I end up when I die? Why am I shaking? What is it that I'm feeling?" While it's difficult to parse these segments out to the lengths that they deserve without spoilers, I can say this. Despite being one of the most tragic characters in this game, he is, at his core, a child. The writing team did not attempt to give him an adult understanding of what it means to live or to die. They allowed him the room to breathe while processing these emotions himself. This runs parallel to what each and every one of us go through in our own lives. I played this game as a child around the ages of roughly 7 or 8, and again throughout high school, and again throughout college, and again throughout 2 graduate degrees, and now again as a man in my 30s. Had you asked me at any time whether or not I knew what it meant to live or to die, I would have certainly offered varying answers or perspectives. The very best I could have done at Vivi's age would have been to work it out the way he had. A lesser studio would have written Vivi's perspective to be significantly more mature, perhaps erudite, somehow possessing knowledge far beyond his emotional development. But not Sakaguchi's team. They had the foresight to know that that's not how children would process such horrible interactions in their own life. The notion of these characters and the full cast being human is one that I'll touch on a lot throughout this series, and Vivi represents perhaps both the most beautiful and tragic sides of that coin. We don't need to focus too much on the heavier aspects of the game, of course. Even through incidental dialogue, seemingly unimportant dialogue, humorous dialogue, it all flows so naturally. And, of course, it's full of charm. A stubborn Steiner not getting information out of an old coffee enthusiast, Zidane flirting with any of the countless women in the game, townspeople airing their petty grievances or simply gossiping. I've heard it said that referring to something as being charming is a meaningless label, that charm is a non-transferable currency. I can see the point of view here. Tastes differ, there's no accounting for taste, and my idea of what is charming may be at odds with yours. But there's an element here of I know it when I see it. When we refer to something as being charming, this conjures a host of characteristics and traits. We inherently know what this means. To put this language under such a microscope, to bring in, actually kind of energy to it, it's not productive, nor is it an altogether interesting point to make. But back to the topic at hand. This game's dialogue is extremely charming. It's colorful. It knows exactly when to take itself seriously or when not to. It doesn't fall into too many predictable tropes or cliches. And while there was plenty of this in Final Fantasy VI, I felt that a lot of it was missing in 7 and 8. Correlation isn't equal to causation, of course, so I'm not fully prepared to blame it on the shift toward realism. It could have been any number of things. And likely was. But the fact remains. I was not invested in the dialogue of 7 or 8 in the same way I was and am with 9. Ultimately, when I think of this game's character writing as a whole, I land on this. It's believable. And that's perhaps the strongest compliment one could give dialogue in a fantasy setting. Despite everything working against it, I fundamentally believe these characters. I believe what they are saying. I believe they are who they say they are. This is paramount for any work of fiction, of any storytelling. This goes beyond dialogue as well. The main cast of Final Fantasy IX is largely made up of fictionalized races. There's only one character who squarely fits into the whole of human, and despite this, I can relate to every single one of them. The trials through which these characters struggle, the desires they hold in their hearts, the pain they feel, it all comes from a very real place, a very human place. These are real-world issues, and many of us face them. A few minutes ago, I talked about Vivi. He's a fan favorite for a reason and has one of the most moving arcs in the entirety of the JRPG genre. It's difficult to discuss his character progression without some serious spoilers, and unfortunately that holds true to most of the cast. To that end, there is one character whose arc we can observe with minimal spoilers. They aren't the most popular character in the game. Indeed, I grew up hating them. But now that I have a full appreciation for the intricacies of the story, I can confidently say that Adalbert Steiner, captain of the Knights of Pluto, is not only my favorite character, but he may be the best one in this game. And his growth through the story represents something that each and every one of us goes through: finding our true selves. There will be mild spoilers ahead for Steiner's story. It's just not possible to talk about it without mentioning a few key plot moments. If you're sensitive to this sort of thing, and I understand and sympathize if you are, please feel free to fast forward via the timestamps in the description. From the moment he's introduced, Adalbert Steiner is, in a word, a buffoon. An oaf, a clumsy, wide, middle-aged man of a character that is the butt of almost every single joke. He seems to exist on the straight and narrow with a single-minded and strict purpose: to fulfill his duties as a royal knight to the queen, the princess, and the kingdom of Alexandria. Throughout the story, Steiner's worldview is consistently challenged, and yes, it is often played for laughs. Who decides what is right or wrong? You? When Steiner is confronted with questions such as this, usually asking him to consider the moral implications or failings of the queen, he tends to default to platitudes or tenets that he believes to be absolute truth. Anybody could tell the difference from right and wrong. The queen would never intentionally do harm. I am but a humble, lowly knight. It is not my place to ponder such things. Steiner exists in his world with blinders. It isn't his duty, he believes, to ponder existence or morality. All he needs to worry about is doing as he is told. In some ways, it's a comfortable existence. As he travels with Zidane and company and meets people from a variety of new perspectives, he is eventually forced to confront his cognitive dissonance. This comes slowly. He decides he won't petition to have Zidane hanged for kidnapping at first. He admits that Zidane could teach Baku, Zidane's boss, a thing or two about manners, and so on and such forth. This snowballs throughout the story, and again, you'll hear this in the coming episodes. But it comes to a head during an attack on Alexandria. Steiner is tasked with Beatrix, an Alexandrian general and somewhat of a workplace rival for Steiner, to protect Alexandria from biblical levels of destruction. Monsters are swarming the streets of the kingdom, property is being demolished, and civilians flee for their lives. As the two fight off beast after beast, fatigue rears its ugly head. Though immensely capable, they can't do this forever. It is in this moment where Steiner's greatest epiphany is had. He isn't only fighting for Alexandria out of duty. He is protecting the kingdom that he has come to love, and moreover, the people he has come to love. He vows there and then to protect Beatrix from harm, and in a second wind fueled entirely by emotion and newfound feelings, enters trance, a state that the game refers to as a surge of emotion. In this moment, Steiner comes to realize that he is not bound by fealty or his job. He is a person, and he has autonomy, wants, desires, feelings. And in this moment, his love for Beatrix allows him to be metaphorically reborn. He is no longer Adalbert Steiner, captain of the Knights of Pluto. He is Adalbert Steiner, man, friend, partner, human. Honestly, I could talk for days about this sequence. It's my favorite in the game, to be quite honest. You'll hear way more about this and in much more depth in episode 4, but let me end by saying this. I relate to Steiner. Not insofar as I am a clueless oaf, although some may say so. I have struggled in the past with identity, with finding a sense of purpose outside of what it is that I do, or even with finding an identity outside of what it is that I do. Even as I write and record this essay, thoughts occasionally seep into my mind. What if nobody likes this? They're going to think that you're a hack, a sloppy writer, not intelligent, not observant. They won't think that you're worth anything. So you better do your duty. Steiner's situation is exaggerated, and purposefully so. However, though very few of us are feudal knights serving a queen or a lord, I would wager to say that all of us have struggled with thoughts about being our own person. Are we unique enough? Are we only as good as our jobs, or our schools, or our family members? It's this line of thought that I always come back to when I say that the cast of Final Fantasy IX is deeply, painfully, beautifully human. You'll hear so many more examples moving forward, but Steiner is my favorite. And I knew I had to talk about him, even if it meant skirting around the eggshells of spoilers. It wouldn't be a Final Fantasy game without talking about the equipment and the battle systems. Final Fantasy IV pioneered the ATB, or Active Time Battle System, that Square became so widely known for. Final Fantasy VII all but did away with classes for the highly customizable Materia system. Final Fantasy VIII went a step further into the divisive and game-breaking Junction system. What does Final Fantasy IX have in store for us? Well, nothing special. Honestly, the battle system itself is pretty tame. Just as the game's aesthetics and tone returned to the series' roots, so too did the combat. The party size has been increased back to 4, like in the original titles. Classes are now baked into each character, similar to the original titles. Even the battle and victory themes have returned largely unaltered. The battle system itself is serviceable and perfectly fine, except for one flaw. It's quite slow. This is actually perhaps my biggest criticism of the game, and a major downside to playing it on original hardware. It isn't so much that the speed of the ATB system is slow, though in truth I do wish that it were just a skosh quicker. It's a combination of the load times, the wait times, and the animations. Each battle begins, after some load time, with a cinematic sweep of the camera from multiple angles across the whole battlefield. It looks really cool, seeing the whole area, the enemies, your party all being shown off in this way. But the charm wanes quickly, as this occurs before every single battle. Adding on to this is the delay in the execution of moves. There's a hidden turn order that's always present. If your ATB bar fills up before your opponents, but you don't select an action before they do, they may get to take their turn before you. Your actions are queued only after you select them. Occasionally, 2, 3, or more actions can be put into the queue at the same time, so it often becomes a waiting game. Will you attack before your opponent? Heal your party member's poison before it chip damages their life away? Sometimes it's hard to tell. Add further onto this the speed of the attack animations themselves, and the result is a sluggish system. I quite like the ATB system in itself, but in future iterations of the series, Final Fantasy X-2 for example, It's much more polished. And hey, using the contemporary and, as of this recording, free Maguri mod largely fixes this issue. Battles play out much quicker and smoother, you can customize the speed, and you can even force turn-based play if you so choose. It's a really terrific mod, and you'll inevitably hear us talk about it in the upcoming episodes. The equipment system too has been overhauled, and it is a joy to see coming off of 7 and 8. The materia and junction systems both have their strengths, and I think they work fine, but the importance of equipment was a bit diminished. In 7, it boiled down to stats and materia slots, and in 8, they almost don't matter at all. 9 brings their importance back in a very cool way. Each piece of equipment you get will have certain abilities and traits associated with it. First, the traits. You might have a piece of armor that has lower defensive and speed stats compared to your current armor, but it might have an added benefit such as 50% reduction in lightning damage. It might absorb damage. The same can be true of weapons. Maybe you have a dagger that's a bit worse than your optimal equipment, but it has the silence status effect bound to it. Suddenly there are layers to our choices here. In tandem with this are the abilities of each piece of equipment. Every piece of equipment is going to have some sort of ability attached to it. Maybe you get the Bird Killer ability, doing 50% extra physical damage to flying enemies. Perhaps you learn one of the numerous abilities that prevent status effects, such as Jelly or Bright Eyes, for petrification and darkness, respectively. You may even have the Level Up, Ability Up, or High Tide abilities, which increase your EXP gained, AP gained, or transmeter progress, again respectively. Now, we have a host of ways we can customize each character. Maybe you want Zidane to always take damage in place of female characters and be immune to many status effects. Or perhaps you want Freya to deal 1.5 times the damage to as many enemy types as possible. The choices are plentiful, and you can reset them at any time you wish outside of battles. There are only 2 conditions here. The first condition is AP requirement. This is self-explanatory. Each ability costs a certain number of AP points to equip, and you only have so many to spend at any given time. You've got to pick and choose. The second condition is much more interesting. In order to fully learn an ability, you must complete the AP growth requirements. For example, let's take Jelly. This ability prevents petrification when equipped to a character. Great! In order for a Marant, a late-game party member, to learn Jelly, it takes 15 AP gained from battles. If you wanted the same ability on Garnet, it would take more than double at 40 AP gained from battles. Now you can still equip Jelly to your party members while they are wearing equipment that teaches it, but until you satisfy the AP growth requirements, you can't remove that equipment and still use Jelly. This adds a really interesting wrinkle to equipping your characters. You might be facing a boss that is able to deal massive damage by using poison and wind-based attacks. If you don't have the corresponding buffs learned, do you choose to re-equip the possibly worse gear? Or do you brave it with optimized stats but less buffs and support abilities? I have always loved this system. It makes things so much more interesting than picking the gear with the highest numbers. It makes it feel like I'm really strategizing when I'm building my party, and that's just so exciting to me. You have to plan prior to battle and think on your feet during it due to the ATB system. As far as I'm concerned, it's a beautiful marriage of planning and fast thinking. Sure, it doesn't reinvent the system or go too outside of the box, but it doesn't need to. Everything that's included just works. Outside of the overall speed of battle, there's little to complain about here. It's a damn solid system. In the opening paragraphs of this short essay, I mentioned that this was the final installment of the series that saw the creator, Hironobu Sakaguchi, in the creative lead chair. I think I speak for many who hold this game so close to their hearts when I say that that's honestly a large reason of why I love it so much. It's a work distinctly in his style. But Sakaguchi isn't the sole person responsible for the Final Fantasy DNA. One could argue that there's another creative, another member of the team responsible for making Final Fantasy what it is and always has been. It should come as no surprise to you that I am, of course, talking about the legendary composer, Nobuo Uematsu. Picking a favorite soundtrack written by Nobuo Uematsu would result in a textbook example of a Pyrrhic victory. You might settle on one, but at what cost? And at that point, was it even worth it? That's what Pyrrhic means, and I definitely did not insert it solely to flex my writing chops a little. I would never do that. To stay on topic though, Uematsu's catalog earns him the title of maestro, and handily. The Final Fantasy series stands tall as a bastion of memorable themes and emotion, of course, but it doesn't stop there. Lost Odyssey brought much of this intensity into the 6th generation of consoles with a bit more of a prog rock influence. Grand Blue Fantasy is a delightful mix of folk and woodwind-heavy scoring, and indeed, even his personal projects are lovely. If you can find it, I highly recommend his 2010 release, 10 Short Stories. What is it that makes Uematsu's compositions stand out? This is something I've talked about before on the show. In fact, I did an entire episode focused on Uematsu and his music with Bar Silence host Jameson on episode 76 of the show. And that being the case, I don't want to spend too much time on his output and style as a whole today. Instead, I'd like to focus on what I think makes 9's OST stand out as my particular favorite in the series. Its exquisite use of melody, leitmotif, and character. The first piece, and arguably in contention to be the most famous, that you'll hear upon starting Final Fantasy IX is A Place to Call Home, also known in Japanese as Itsuka Kaeru Tokoro, the place I'll return to someday. A fitting start indeed. Just as Sakaguchi had intended the environments of Final Fantasy IX to return to that of Renaissance-inspired fantasy, Uematsu followed suit with this opening theme's early music aesthetics. A few things stand out to me immediately. A Place to Call Home is a short, contrapuntal composition featuring a 3-piece recorder consort. This stylistic choice differs greatly from series openings in the past and future. Gone is the intense orchestration of the Final Fantasy VIII opening, which, may I say, is brilliant. And we certainly saw a drastic departure with the butt rock opening of 10. Okay, I did technically skip 2 Xanarkand to use butt rock to further my point, but the point still stands. Instrumental consorts became popular within the Renaissance period, specifically, though not exclusively, in secular music. The composition itself is modal in nature. It is not in a defined major or minor key. This too was common in the Renaissance era. Tonality as we know it to exist today was not solidified in such a way to give us the tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic motion of harmonic progression. This would come in time, due to changes beginning with the Secunda Practica and the evolution into what would become the Baroque period roughly around the beginning of the 1600s. But prior to this, standard practice harmony wasn't established such that major and minor keys were talked about like they are today. A fitting choice for Uematsu to make indeed, as it gives this opening a flavor not dissimilar to Renaissance composers at the time, such as Claudio Monteverdi or Josquin du Prez. I'd also like to take a minute to shout out and apologize to my early music professor from my final graduate degree. I've never learned so much about this beautiful musical period from anybody else, but I also haven't thought about it deeply in quite some time. I hope this information is accurate. Even if you aren't familiar with Renaissance music or stylistic trends, one thing becomes clear immediately. This track has a good melody. And this doesn't let up throughout the rest of the game. Uematsu has many strengths as a composer, but much like composers such as Prokofiev and Tchaikovsky before him, he is adept at creating earworms. Catchy melodies. There are a myriad of examples throughout the soundtrack of Final Fantasy IX. Dark City Treno, the village of Dali, even the Chocobo theme, here remixed on the ukulele. This is nothing necessarily new, as evidenced by Uematsu's full catalog. Zozo, Kefka's theme, the theme of love, even the original prelude. The contour, the pitches, the rhythm. There's a time and a place to dissect music in this way, but suffice it to say, they're all lovely melodies. And what does one do when they have an abundance of lovely melodies? Well, they attach them to a feeling, a theme, or even a character, and use them to enhance other pieces or songs. This is what we call a leitmotif. This was perhaps used most famously by Richard Wagner and Hector Berlioz, and can essentially be thought about in this way. It's a segment, melody, or a theme that represents a character, place, or idea. Let's listen to Vivi's theme once more. Got that? Now, let's take a listen to the theme of Black Mage Village. As you can hear, Black Mage Village is Vivi's theme. While this example is a touch on the nose, it illustrates the point well. Uematsu took the melody of Vivi's theme, the notes and the rhythms, and reworked them into a new setting. Composers can augment the melody by making it longer, compress it, invert it, convert it to the relative major or minor key. Depending upon the situation, there are a host of things one could do to a leitmotif to elicit an emotion. Why play Vivi's theme here? Well, because Vivi is a black mage. These are his people. It hits a little harder in the game as you're following Vivi's story, to be clear. The music itself cannot and does not do all the work. Think of it as adding the finishing seasonings into a good soup or stew. The foundation is already there, and the final adjustments are what will bring out the true essence of the flavor, or, here, the emotion. Leitmotifs can be found throughout Uematsu's catalog, and there are even more examples in Final Fantasy IX. As I mentioned, this isn't the time or place to do a deep dive into them. See our episode on his music. But I would be remiss not to talk about the leitmotif of Final Fantasy IX itself, and the composer's favorite track, Melodies of Life.
Alone for a while, I've been searching through the dark for traces of the love you left inside my lonely heart.
This melody permeates the entirety of Final Fantasy IX. It is Final Fantasy IX. It is referenced, sometimes more obviously than others, in so many of the game's tracks. It can be heard when Steiner crashes into the tower in the early game. It can be heard during Garnet's visit to South Gate. It's a part of Garnet's theme proper, and we even hear her singing it in the game. And it can be argued that it is the theme of Gaia itself. It's what we hear when we traverse around the world map. The game simply cannot exist independent of this theme. And why should it? This is a game about living, about finding the joy of living through experiences with those you love. It is this that makes life worthwhile, that staves off the uncertainty of what happens after we die. It's about finding a place to call home. And how fitting that that track, A Place to Call Home, bookends the game with this one. If I can be honest, I hated this song as a kid. I didn't like any of the singing in video game music. It distracted me. Now that I'm an adult and I can appreciate different mediums of art coming together, this is my favorite track on this entire album. I can't get through it without crying. It should be noted that although Uematsu composed this track, the lyrics were written by Hiroyuki Ito under the credited name of Shiomi, one of the directors, battle system designers, and scenario writers on this team. The track was then arranged by Shiro Hamaguchi and sung in both English and Japanese by Emiko Shiratori. I think it might be best to simply let the music speak for itself. It says more than I could ever hope to, no matter how many words I write.
A voice from the past, joining yours and mine, adding up the layers of harmony. And so it goes on and on. Melodies of life to the sky beyond the flying bird.
Quote, ultimately, what we did was set an overall theme for the game, and that was living, with an exclamation point. We felt that if we showed how the different characters strived and lived their lives to the fullest, it would make the game more interesting. End quote. Event designer Kazuhiko Aoki. Final Fantasy IX is an incredibly special JRPG. It is a high fantasy story that is more human than many games taking place in our human world. It is thematically focused. It has the synergy, trust, and love found within a long-time creative team. And finally, I think this last point stands clearest of all. It is my favorite game of all time. I hope you've enjoyed this companion piece, and I hope you continue to enjoy the upcoming episodes. 4 more episodes, around 10 hours, discussing as much of this game as we can, top to bottom. If any of the topics within this essay interested you, you'll hear more about them throughout the rest of this series. Sakaguchi and Uematsu could not have closed out the golden years of Final Fantasy in a better way. I have no doubt in my mind. The game's theme, Melodies of Life, says it best. Our paths, they did cross, though I cannot say just why. We met, we laughed, we held on fast, and then we said goodbye. And who will hear the echoes of stories never told? Let them ring out loud till they unfold. My name is Rick Firestone. I am the host of the pixelprojectradio podcast. Please enjoy the remainder of this series on my favorite game of all time. This is our analysis on Final Fantasy IX.